Hey, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice coffee. The next talk is from Ben Holliday. He's Executive Director of Design at FutureGov. I'm sure he's going to tell you all about that. Welcome, Ben. It's great to have you here. And
Thanks, Dave.
if we can cue the recording, Kirsty, take it away, Ben.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. So this is the Asking Design Questions talk. So fantastic to be part of Virtual UX Bristol. I'm Ben Holliday. This was actually my first trip out of the house for work in 16 months. I had to get the train last week. I actually made it as far as Bristol Parkway. So I managed to get a photograph near Bristol. So it feels like I've kind of been there in spirit for this conference, but really great to be part of today. Really great to share with you. To introduce myself, I'm an executive director for design at FutureGov. So I've spent the last 20 years working in design, so starting out in graphic design, then I worked in digital and UX design, and then later on I've worked with product service, content and organization design teams. The last 8 years I've been mostly working in the public sector. That's leading design teams, working as part of change and transformation programs. My journey into public sector work is I worked for the Government Digital Service for a year. I was then part of DWP Digital, and that's the digital and technology part of the Department for Work and Pensions, so leading the design team there. Before I kind of worked in the public sector, I was part of private sector organisations. So I started out in education. I've worked in finance with an organisation called Free Agent, which you might have heard of. And I've worked a lot with the arts, charity and not-for-profit organisations as well. I live all the way up in Kendal in Cumbria, so if you're tuning in today near Bristol or down in the southwest, I'm up in the northwest as I'm recording this. I live with my family and also our very large 5-month-old puppy, which is shown to the left. So that's me. So I'm going to talk about asking design questions today, but I always start by talking about, like, why is design a good idea? Like, why are we interested in design? Like, how does it help shape our organizations? How does it help us to add value where we work? So these are the kind of things I think about in that context. Number one is framing. So the idea that design is really a process, or user-centered design, of centering the problems that we're solving around real user experience, like what might or could happen in terms of how people experience things and the outcomes that design helps us to deliver. Visualizing, so how design can communicate ideas and concepts more clearly. So how do we understand how things work now? How do we understand the perspective of different groups of people that interact with the things that we're building, that we're making? And this is really like why I think it's so important, like UX and service designers in general, like we make a lot of maps, we visualize, we create artifacts that help us to understand, that bring people to shared understanding. Creating, so how we make things happen. So this can be approaches to research. It can be really how we're creative with the process of working with the people we're designing for. For me, like, creating is really how we explore, how we combine, how we develop ideas to solve problems and to find new opportunities. The next reason I think design is a good idea is this kind of concept of connecting. So how do we solve whole problems for users? So connecting in design is really the process of building relationships within systems. It's how we create, it's how we join up end-to-end experiences. And this could mean bringing together different products, tools, even organizations, in terms of how different parts of a system work together to deliver the right outcomes, the right experiences for people. A really important one, that design is a good idea because it's learning by doing. And I'm going to talk about this more today. It's really about making things real. So the ability to prototype, how do we create things that allow people to interact with real models of the world, to learning through what happens. And it's this mindset of experimentation, and that's a type of design questioning as well. And then finally, the idea of continuously improving. So really, for me, this is the ability to keep going. Like, design is never done. It's a continuous process of asking questions about how things can be improved, how things need to change. and also understanding that everything around us is moving. It's always about the next set of questions that we're willing to ask about how things could change, how things can work better in a new context and in response to what's happening around us. And I think as design, and especially working in public sector design, we've seen that more and more, especially through the COVID pandemic, and just how fast things can and are changing around us in our lives as well. So in terms of how I'm going to frame this today, like all of those aspects of like what makes design a good idea are really the result of working as part of a team or working as part of an organization. It's the value that we might be able to add when working with other people. And the idea for this talk is really tied into this debate that's been going on almost like, it feels like forever, like the question of, is everybody a designer? And the reality for me is that most products and services are really like, they're the result of the work and the decisions of people. On the whole, that often we don't call designers, they're business people, operational people, technologists. Like these are often people that work with specialist designers, but not always. And you're probably familiar with Jared Spool, like he's probably most recently best known as the founder of Center Center. So that's a user experience design school in the US. Like he's massively followed in places like Twitter and blogs and writes a lot. If you search and look at kind of his writing and tweets, like he quite often talks about this idea that anybody who influences what the design becomes is the designer. And it's been quite controversial, but you can see if you go back a few years, you can see when he first said it. You can also see that he keeps saying it as well. And it's become this kind of big debate in UX design, I think, and like cue lots of responses telling him why he's potentially wrong, people defending the role of design specialists. This is an example of somebody just arguing that the word designer loses all meaning as soon as we make it open to everyone. I could have picked like many blog posts to share. Like this one is by Daniel Burker. You probably heard of him. Like he's ex-Google Ventures, so one of the guys that was involved with the whole thing around design sprints, if you've ever worked with that set of methods. This is his take. Like Jared Spool had said that Netflix performance engineers are designers because they're affecting the user experience by the decisions that they make. And if I was to kind of not sit on the fence here, like I say, I actually agree. Like I think the decisions and the work of anybody that determines user experience has to be part of what we think of as design, and that's really important. But just to say that I'm not here to win the argument of is everybody a designer. I actually think there's a better way to think about it, and this is really the idea and really what I want to focus on as part of this talk. That I don't think it matters if you're a product manager, if you're a graphic designer, you're a user researcher, like you could even be like a social worker in local government or a community volunteer that's part of like how the vaccination service is being rolled out in the UK by the NHS. I think the important thing is that everyone can start to ask or learn to ask what I call design questions. This is really based on the presumption that we can agree that everything is designed, whether that's intentionally or not. And that's the result of decisions within kind of services, products, change programs. All of that comes together, which means we end up with how something works, with how it looks, how it feels. And I do think that we benefit from design specialists. And just to say really clearly, like I still love you, design specialists, but it doesn't matter as much as how we make good design happen. And that's what I want to explore today. So to give you a definition, design questions really are this idea that we can introduce constraints, they provide focus, they create shared understanding, and the goal is really just good design. And that's what I'd want to kind of explore. Really, it's about how do we get to the best solutions? How do we best meet people's needs? And really talking about how we both meet practical needs, but also when we think about experience, emotional needs, like how is that all wrapped up in experience? What are people able to do? And how in terms of asking better design questions, can that lead to better outcomes? To give you a little bit of history, like this is back when I worked for DWP Digital in 2014 to 2017. And this is when I first started thinking about design questions. DWP was a really large organization, so more than 70,000 staff, a really big portfolio of work, like big technology portfolio. And this is a picture of the growing design team. We were starting to get spread out across work, across this whole organization. User-centered design was still quite new to the organization. But this is really just showing you that there were lots of kind of designers and researchers starting to be employed at DWP, starting to be kind of in different places with different types of influence. And my original design questions were really like going around and seeing the work, like just why are we here doing this particular piece of work? And how do we know if this particular program here, are we doing the right things? And I found really quickly that teams or organizations, and I've seen it since as well, often we just don't have a really good understanding of the problem that we're working on or why we're doing the work. And like DWP early on, there was a really good example of this. Like teams were going into discovery phases and it simply wasn't very clear to me like what they were doing and why. And often the teams themselves were unclear, or there was different types of understanding, like people understood the problem differently that they were working on. There wasn't that shared understanding. And where this got me to is this idea that actually I found again and again, I was visiting, like we had 5 digital hubs. I was visiting these different teams in different places. And actually I was asking our designers, I was asking these teams the same questions, the same 5 questions. And actually in the end, I wrote these down as a blog post in 2015. And it's really interesting because these questions have become like the most read and shared blog post I've ever written. Like they've gone across government teams in the UK and beyond. I know of people that use them in the private sector. But really, these are really simple questions. They're really simple design questions. And just to kind of run you through those briefly, like number 1 was why are we doing the work? Or like, what is our motivation for building this product and service? Number 2 is who are our users? So who do we think would actually use this product or service? Or who do we think is going to use it? What are our assumptions about who these people are and where they are and what they need to do? And then that leads on to like, what outcome will users get from this service? So what problem are we trying to solve for people? And then really balanced against that as well, like being very honest with ourselves. If we're trying to meet this set of user needs, like what are we looking for as an organization? Like quite often there are business goals hidden within the kind of brief that we're working on. Like what outcome are we looking for? Like it might, if we're being honest, like this work might have been commissioned because of cost savings. It might be because of a policy decision, especially if we're working in government. And then all of those things combined, like how are we going to measure against these outcomes in terms of how well we're meeting these needs, how well we're meeting that balance of organization goals and objectives and also priorities. Like what are our key metrics? How are we going to show progress? So I was able to publish this blog post. Like I say, it got kind of really well read. It got really well used. We ended up using this method as almost like a workshop format. And this is just one picture I could find here of like doing this on Post-it notes. More recently, I've kind of done this on a Miro board as we've kind of moved away from being in the same spaces. And we've used it a lot of FutureGov as well. Like the 5 questions, it works really well as a workshop format. And really the whole thing here is about how do we get people to a shared understanding. It's about a group of people in a room or virtually starting off like not really knowing what each other are thinking, but by the end of it actually saying like, this is our shared understanding of the answer to these 5 questions, like aligning the work at this point. Like what you can do is take one question at a time. You can ask the group to write one thing per Post-it note. If you do that, maybe give 5 minutes per question, you can affinity sort, you can group those around themes, and then somebody can facilitate and talk you through what you're learning. And really all of that moving you towards this shared understanding that helps you start a discovery, helps you revisit kind of key assumptions during an alpha phase of delivery or design. I should say as well, like this works like in small groups or large groups. This was my kind of world record attempt at UX Riga, which was an event in Latvia in 2015. You see, we ran this, we kind of had 6 groups working on the same topic. And in the end, I brought it all back together. But like simple questions can just help facilitate understanding and conversation around a single brief or a single topic. And just to say, like, what I was trying to do with this first set of design questions was really, it was about adding context or understanding constraints. Like quite often what we're doing, especially in government kind of digital work, is where we've got a product problem. Like we've been asked to work on a digital solution or part of a service. It's moving maybe part of a service online. Quite often that was the sort of digital government strategy at the time. Like how do we move things online so they're quicker, simpler and faster? And it's really important to say as well, it's like sometimes like starting from a product perspective, it's fine, like it's important. It's really where people are directly interacting with our organizations, with our services. What I thought would be helpful to do is just to really define some of this context that we're exploring. So quite often we're starting with the question of what is the product? So for me, that's the digital solution. It's the tools that our staff might be using, but it's what is helping people to do something, whether that's inside or outside of our organization. And really it's the set of interactions, it's the transactions, and it's the thing that is helping people to achieve a goal. And then the context of that, if we can start to look at that question, is really what is the service? So supporting people's needs in real life scenarios is the way that I think about that. So that could be a combination of these online, but also offline touch points and the support that is leading towards an outcome or for something to happen. And then the question of what is the system? So for me, a system is really about the interdependencies that work and function together. So this idea of like, we're working on things that are inherently complex, like networks of organizations, parts of government policy all working together. As a quick example, if I took a FutureGov example, like something like working in housing with local authorities, like you might be commissioned to work on a product, which is like helping people to apply for the housing register, like for a council website. You might then look at the service, which is really like, what is the local housing services? So the council team that are providing advice and help to prevent homelessness. And that might be services within that, like how do you get families emergency accommodation at short notice? And then what is the system? So the idea that there's a housing system, there's housing policy that's national, that's regional as well within that. So there are regional strategies, there are multi-agency partnerships, and there's service management that all supports all of these different layers. And just to give you an idea as well of how much work is still needed to fix government services, like I had a look locally in Cumbria, like this is what it looks like if you try and get support for housing or emergency housing in Cumbria. And this is what you have to go through if you're at risk of becoming homeless. Like you can see that actually things like content design, basic kind of design around how accessible this is just not great, to be honest. And like getting help or understanding how to get help is just much harder than it should be. And this is why I think it's so important that design is part and design questions are part of how we can improve our public services. But to move on quite quickly, like really what we're doing here is building a map. Like we're starting to question relationships. I put this example in really for the sheer scale of a system view. Even if you can't see the detail here, like this is work by Alex Torrance at FutureGov with Hounslow Council, that he was working on this map. And it shows the different agencies involved in supporting vulnerable children and people care. So that's really how we understand data being collected throughout a system through different partners and how that's managed, but really about somebody's experience, about how they're supported. And this as-is view, if you were to zoom into it, it really starts to show how services and individual products and touch points and the way that partners work together, it's not joined up. Like there's a lot of manual process involved in how individual agencies contact each other to get information about individual cases. And really that really leads into the quality of support that we're able to offer. And this idea of building the map is really about conversations, whatever sort of map we're building. Like designers love maps, like they're a way of exploring and understanding context. And a good map is really about starting to show us this product, service, system relationships with the user needs that we're starting to explore and understand. And there's always this question of like, where are we in the map and where that can take us? And I think maps are really about the ambition that comes through questioning what already exists and what could exist. And like I've said already, like maps are really like the spaces, they show the spaces in between things and they start to question what's possible. And as I mentioned then, like really this is about user needs. So through asking questions and getting these new perspectives, we can start to better understand user needs. So what is it people need to do? What is the support that they need? How does that sit within the product services system context that we're looking at? And how do we start to see relationships between different types of needs? And when I talk about needs, like quite often we talk about the practical things, so like joining the housing register, but actually there's the whole thing around moving home, like life events, needing care. Like this is about people and relationships. like going back a few years again, this came out of some of the work we were doing at DWP Digital, like the difference between emotional and practical needs. So emotional needs being much more open, like in these kind of open spaces where we're trying to understand the context, and quite often the messy context of what's really happening in our lives and the life events that we're experiencing. The way I kind of always explain it is like finding a job, which was a DWP example, is a really practical thing. There are practical steps, there's practical support. But the fear of losing your job and the effects of that, how that might affect your home stability, your family stability, is actually, there's a set of emotional needs in there that also need to be met. The whole idea of having a safety net in the welfare system is about actually meeting an emotional need that actually there is support there if you need it, or there should be. To go back to my other example, like applying for the local housing register is practical, but it's not the same as having a stable long-term place to live. And we can start to think about this different relationship. And I really love the thing as well, this kind of idea that we can kind of prise open the system. So sometimes we do start kind of with this bigger view. This is a quote from Matt Edgar, who is he's transformation director at NHSX these days, and says we can kind of look to see the human needs and the choices that these then create and sustain when we start to look at a system set of relationships. And I think we have to be able to zoom in to get much closer to real human experience. Like I should say that this was in response to a Henrik van Haren NHS Digital blog post in 2016, which is that there are always real needs in a system, and we have to look at those from emotional to the practical and the more transactional. To give you a couple of really nice examples, that I love this. This is Royal Aberdeen Children's Hospital. And this is an example that they've got this car and children are able to drive themselves through to like where the operating theatre. And it's like an experience design thing. And I love the fact that they tweeted this. I love the fact that really they're starting to think about like, how do you start to design for children being scared and frightened while they have this, you know, hospital experience in these really difficult situations. There's another lovely example as well, which is in this book by Rachel Clark, Dr. Rachel Clark, called Dear Life. And it talks about the experience of like a children's play specialist. And quite often, like children have to go to radiotherapy and their parents can't be there with them. And they're in these rooms, they're separated, they're with these loud and intimidating machines. If you've ever like had an MRI scan, you'll know what I mean. And they came up with this idea of like using coloured string, and they let the child hold the string while they're in the kind of room with the machines. And they can run this string all the way through the corridor to the parent standing outside. So the child knows that mummy or daddy is still there on the other side. They're there, they're caring for them, and they're holding on to the other end of this string. They're still connected. And I really love stuff like this, like thinking about emotional need. Sometimes like you could say like practically we don't need to do this, but this is so important when we think about health and health outcomes and well-being, and it's all part of how really we need to think about design. So just with the time we've got left, I really just want to quickly open up like what are the other design questions that maybe we should be asking? Like what could we think about? And I think there's really like 5 areas that I've been thinking about more and more as I've started to look at this, like direction, the idea of impact in design, inclusion, exclusion, breakpoints, and design doing. So to talk to the first one, direction, like I've mentioned already that framing is a really important part of how design adds value. And again, the idea of centering a problem around a real user experience. And there's this design question really that I think we have to ask, like, what is it we're working towards, and what is the ideal future for this? Whether that's a product or service or a kind of a bigger change. And so to give you an example, like it's been fascinating and like really interesting seeing the response in the pandemic. And quite often now, I think we're in the position as designers where we have to ask, like, is the response radical enough? And it didn't take me long to find a Bristol example. Like we've seen local places change overnight, like converting streets, shutting streets, creating cycle networks, radically changing kind of in order to adapt to the pandemic, to adapt to lockdowns. And really, it has shown us that radical change is possible, where there's the real power and the shared ambition and direction to make that possible. If you compare that, though, to something like the climate emergency, we haven't seen the same radical approaches. Like most councils were declaring a climate emergency a year before the pandemic, but we didn't see the radical kind of approaches to shutting streets, creating clearer air, challenging transport systems and approaches to that, reducing car use. And I think the direction we're taking in this sense needs that ambition. It needs those design questions. So the next one is impact. And really, like, how is this product, service, or change being experienced in the places and with the people it's impacting? And this is a similar point, like it's thinking about the changes in places, how we experience them, how our lives are changing because of the design decisions that are being made around us. And that could be even things as simple as like how we're trying to put new cycling infrastructure in, as much as it could be the housing system in local government. And I think the only way we really start to understand this, the only way we start to answer this question is through the people that getting closer to the real experiences of people that this is impacting. I love this example as well, and I've used this lots and lots, but I think you have to be able to zoom in and out. You have to be able to get closer to real experience. And I love the idea of Google Maps. I love the way that it lets you zoom in from a satellite image to people crossing the road right in front of you. And it's this idea that design is multi-directional. It's never only what happens here, the perspective we have from where we're designing from. And that sometimes is that satellite image. It's that big system map I showed you in Hounslow of kind of how children's services is working and school support. Sometimes actually you have to get in, you have to be closer to that context. And a good design question is like, who is this actually helping? And then how close are we to their real experience? The next question I really wanted to look at is this idea of inclusion and exclusion. And this has never really felt more important in design. And we're really seeing ourselves challenged on this by what's happening in the world around us. Who is excluded by this product, service, or change? And who doesn't it reach? And I think this is especially true if it's a digital service. Like we've seen a big push to move public services online to make transactional parts of government cheaper, faster, and simpler, like I was showing before. I think we have to think about kind of how do we work harder to work with communities, with people that are potentially excluded, harder to reach groups. How do we make this work for everyone? This is another older example that I love. Like you might be familiar with the OXO Good Grips kitchen tools that have become real symbols of like products designed to work for everyone. This is in the film Objectified by Gary Hewitt, and it talks about Smart Design's design of this potato peeler. And it's the idea that by starting with the needs of people that are outliers, so it's designed for people with arthritis, actually it's become the standard for what like a good handle grip looks like. Another really good example is the cordless kettle. Like it was designed for people with limited mobility, but actually as a piece of industrial product design, it's better for everyone. And I mean, it's a really important question here for designers of like, where should we start? Who could we start with? Could we look at those outliers, those extreme cases? Could that actually help us to better design for everyone? This is the other really similar question as well of like where services reach. And I think I mentioned the vaccination program earlier. The vaccination program is important because to work, it has to reach as many people as possible. It has to try and, I think it's like 85–90% of people have to be vaccinated for everybody to really be protected. And there's this thing they're using now, vaccination buses. Like this is an example from a bus that was visiting Elswick in Newcastle. Like it's targeting places that have historically experienced health inequalities. Like these are areas associated with deprivation. In part, these are areas where there's, you know, people from like represented from ethnic minority backgrounds more and more. So in this example, like the BBC report, which I've linked to here, like they spoke to a local community champion. And this is all about like taking the service to the community that were excluded, the community that weren't accessing the services. And when the community started to see this arriving like where they lived, where they were, actually that made it more accessible. And it actually, I think something like 150 people were vaccinated on this Sunday morning because the bus arrived in this area and the community champions were able to get people to step on board and get vaccinated. And then this really takes me on to kind of the next one, which is this idea of breakpoints. So what will happen if and when this product service change breaks? Like who does it break for? And design, if we're thinking about it as everybody is designing, this scenario of everybody contributing to design, it's really how we ask the right questions to manage risk. Like what are the unintended consequences of how things break? And I've got a few examples for you really quickly. That this example of like Tesla have been making um, solar roof panels. So basically tiles which are, that are solar powered, which is a great idea. Like potentially really fantastic innovation. But you can see here that actually they found that they were too heavy for the houses that they were fitting them on. Like most roof structures just weren't well designed enough to take the weight of these roof tiles. And this is really that design quite often is really about unintended consequences, like learning how things break. And this is a perfect example. And quite often in tech, like there's this kind of mantra of move fast and break things. But it's a lot more important if we're thinking about health, if we're thinking about housing systems, like where things break, it really starts to affect people's lives. It becomes much more important. This is another example. You might remember National Rail Inquiries changing their website design to black and white as a mark of respect for the Duke when the Duke of Edinburgh died earlier this year. And like nobody asked the question of who does this then break for. Like it made it totally inaccessible for people, like colorblind people, who are colorblind. And there's always this question, and it really comes down to like, have we got diverse enough teams sometimes to ask the question, like, who is this going to break for? Who are we excluding from this as the result of this design decision? And this particular example, it actually got national news coverage because it kind of broke the site for so many people. And then like a last couple, which are just perfect, examples I've experienced. Quite often I think of design as like we're dealing with white space. Like it's really the gaps in between things defining the rest of the experience, like going back to the map and how successful that outcome might be. Quite often the white space in design, it's really the gaps between things are also defining the success of the things that we can see. It's defined by what we can't see. And that's the same for services and systems. This is an example. Like I moved house with my family before Christmas and we needed a new tumble dryer. So it's very much a first world problem. This is the screenshot of the confirmation of the purchase that I made online. That I won't say who it was with, but you could probably work that out. I didn't get a confirmation email for some reason, but emails go missing and I had the order number and the payment was showing as pending on my bank account. And then about a week later, nothing arrived. And then the day after that, nothing arrived. And then still nothing was arriving, like they didn't meet the delivery slot. And I found that ringing customer services meant you were redirected back to the website. And it had actually been made impossible to speak to somebody, and they'd effectively shut down their customer service lines. And I think there were reasons like because of COVID and not being able to run call centers. But actually the only option was web chat, sorry. And as you can see, if you read this, I had this very long, almost quite comical kind of conversation with this poor person on web chat who was insisting they'd never received my order and it was probably my fault. And all of this, it was the experience of the service. And in the end, I never got a tumble dryer from this company. And needless to say, I bought one from somewhere else. But essentially, as an experience, I fell through the gaps. Something went wrong. It was probably a failure of technology somewhere, like the website not fully processing a payment. But my point is that people have experiences like this all the time. And we have to have good design questions if we're going to create good joined up user experiences and successful outcomes. My final example is this one, this is how I have to talk to my GP. In our family GP practice, they ask us to book appointments and make requests via the website. I found though, almost by accident, the service is actually only switched on during kind of GP opening hours, which is kind of daytime office hours. And when I last used the service, it didn't actually tell you this anywhere in the app. It just said it wasn't available. And it also didn't signpost to NHS 111, which is where you should go in an emergency if you need to see a GP out of hours. And it comes back again, like nobody asks the question, like what happens if? What happens out of hours? What if? Running through these scenarios, and these, this could be really emergency situations during COVID where people need support. And I won't even get into some of the design of these apps. And like we're seeing really great progress. Actually, the NHS apps are really well built and delivered and much more kind of designed in terms of whole service problems by NHS Digital. But a lot of GP surgeries have still got these kind of disconnected experiences, which potentially aren't meeting people's needs very well as more and more we're pushed to do things online and digital by default. And it's really this idea that often good design starts with a broken experience, and we have to ask the questions about how we then make that possible. And then just to conclude, really all of this is a question of design doing. So as I set out at the start, like design creates value through learning by doing, and it's really about making things real. And for me, doing is a process of questioning. Like we're modeling, we're saying, how could this work? How can it work better? Like, what if I tried it this way? What if I made that adjustment? It's this process. And really, like, this for me is prototyping, like whether it's like this paper prototyping, like doing is this process of small iterative experiments, like learning what doesn't work to learn more about what does or what will, like focusing on the right outcomes in order to work through that process. And I said the word modeling already, but this is a photo I took in MoMA just before lockdown, actually, in New York. And it's a Frank Lloyd Wright building. It's a kind of scale model. You can sort of see it compared to the guy in the background there. And like it's building out, like modeling and designers modeling is building out with the materials we have. It's questioning each decision and evaluating each model as you go. And I think there's so much we can learn from architecture here. I call it service modeling, building out. That we can make sure we model service and product scenarios. So asking how things break, how things are experienced, looking at that white space, at those gaps in between touch points that we're designing, understanding how things connect together, understanding the product to the service to the system context and how that works. And I think it's really, really important we don't get fooled into thinking that questions are just for research. Like questions are a tool really that help us experiment, help us build out, help us explore how things need to work. And then we can do that at different levels of scale as we prototype, as we pilot, as we build joined up experiences and move those into real world scenarios. And then just to conclude, like really, like this for me feels like the most pressing question we can ask. And quite often we have these how might we questions in design, but I think we also need to ask why are we? Especially now, like, are we really the best placed people to solve this problem? There's a lot of privilege in design and how we found ourselves as in roles as designers, and I've not got time to explore that in more detail today. But really, who is better placed to solve this problem? And quite often, just really simply, how do we work with them? How do we reach these communities, the people that are really experiencing these services? How do we get closer to that? How do we zoom in on the map again? So to conclude, let's not pretend that we're all smart enough, unbiased enough, or best placed to have all the answers. But what we can do is to start to ask better questions that help us to make good design happen. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So we've got time for a few questions. And the first one is, how early do you start asking these design questions? Within proposals or project shaping activities? How early do you start asking these questions, Ben?
So if we're talking about the original 5 questions, like quite often I've used those early on. So if you're doing discovery work or you're doing a project kickoff, they work really well. I think, and hopefully this came through in the talk, that it's just really important to keep asking design questions. So like really making sure that we're constantly aligning to the direction and the goals that we've set out. So quite often what I found with teams is even if we do ask these questions, that kind of needle which kind of points us at true north, like the right direction, the right focus on the right users, it tends to move as we move. So actually revisiting these quite often is really important as well. So even if you've done the project kickoff, like have them on the wall, you know, go back to them, have them on the Miro board, keep asking them, saying like, has our understanding of this changed because of what we've learned, because of the research we've done, because of the things we've tested? And I think you can revisit that way. And the newer questions that I kind of introduced there as well, I think again, they're things that are really holding us to account to deliver the right thing, to deliver the right outcome. But it's recognizing everything's changing around us all of the time as we're working, the conditions, the constraints. So we have to keep asking good design questions.
Okay, great. And what's a good next question? Any tips for when whoever commissions the project and they set a tight time frame? Any tips for how to deal with that?
I'm not sure I understand that question. So can you repeat that, Dave?
Yeah, so when somebody commissions a project and sets a time frame that's quite tight, do X by a certain time. How do you handle that?
I would still try and have a conversation. Like, really, you could talk through the 5 questions. You could talk through like one question of why are we doing this work and how do we make sure that we deliver the right outcomes, the right things based on why we've been asked to do this. Like, you can have that conversation. I think it's riskier not to. But the danger is always that the shared understanding isn't there. So we're all working to deliver slightly different things, even if we're working as a team. What you could do as well, and I've done this before, like if you've got kind of governance processes in terms of how work is commissioned or how work gets set up, you could even build these questions into that process. So if a team is trying to, if somebody's trying to set up a team in a department or in an organization, they have to answer these questions about the work up front. So they make their assumptions explicit, and then actually that gives the team gives them insights and information to work with, and they can look at that and say, okay, well, what here feels like a risky assumption as well? And quite often, actually, if you're limited on time, like start with the question, like, what are our riskiest assumptions? Like, what are the things in here that we think are most likely to stop us from delivering what we've been asked to deliver in this short time frame?
Okay, great, thank you. A question from Giles Carrington. How would you format or present the answers to these different questions? So aside from post-it notes in a workshop, excuse me, sorry. So question from Giles Carrington. How would you format or present the answers to these questions?
Yeah, so in terms of like the outputs, quite often when we used to have a wall space and people in one place, I'd keep them on the wall. Quite often I might make them into posters if they're really good insights and they help keep the team focused and keep bringing people back to them. It can work really well on a Miro board if you've got a project board which has got kind of goals, all of the kind of building blocks of the work you're doing. This is part of that. So again, put them somewhere visible, put that information, those data points somewhere visible where you can keep coming back and having the conversation. But I used to love having it in a wall space because you can gather people around, you can have the conversation around the questions. Every sprint, every couple of weeks, you can keep saying, like, has this changed? Have we moved away from this? What do we know that's new? Are these assumptions are we more confident about the assumptions we made to start with? But really just visibility. I've seen people design them into kind of more visual posters. You might even map some of this against like a journey map or a service map, but make sure that information goes with you on that process of designing the service or the product or the work you're doing in a system, whatever the kind of level you're working at, as I talked about.
Okay, great. And 2 last questions, Ben.
Okay.
Yeah, and well, as a designer, it can feel like you're supposed to have all the answers. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I guess that's the problem, because we don't. And more, I think we've got to recognize that our own perspective isn't enough. And I think bringing people into this process who maybe don't call themselves designers is really a way of solving that as well. Like I said, like anybody can ask design questions. I do think it's okay. Like I've always said in design, and there's a mantra of like strong opinions are okay. Like my design philosophy is very much that strong ideas are good, but we work as hard as we can to prove ourselves wrong. It's not about trying to prove ourselves right, and it's that mindset. So quite often, like we can have assumptions about the answers to these questions without probably enough evidence early on, but then we've got to do the hard work to go and make sure that we increase the confidence we have in, are we working to design for the right people in the right places in the right ways? So yeah, confidence is fine. We haven't got all the right answers, and the only way we do that as well is to work with people, with communities, and with the people that are actually going to use products and services that we're working on. We can't, be arrogant and think that we're going to come up with the right answers in isolation from real life and real situations.
Okay, great, Ben, thank you. So that's all the time we've got for questions today, but there are more questions on the Slack, so
I'll jump on Slack. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone.
And thanks for your great talk.